Hi, I want to welcome you to a four-part video series on the psychology of sustainability. In this first video, I'll be discussing how psychology approaches the issues of sustainability and climate change, and to draw from clinical psychology in order to address concepts like eco-anxiety and environmental trauma, and also to provide an analysis of our relation to nature and what it means to be sustainable. Video 2 will explore what cognitive and evolutionary psychology can tell us about how we think about and make decisions regarding sustainability. Video 3 will take a step further and look at how we can motivate behaviors for sustainable action. In video 4, we'll return to the human and nature connection and explore how nature therapy can serve as a way to reconnect with our world as subject rather than object, and how we can build resilience and learn to live with the future that we are creating every single day. Psychology is very much a human science. That is, it's historically centered around human experience as being of particular importance, and in some ways philosophically separated from the natural world. However, emerging fields of psychology have begun to engage in a form of work that reconnects us to the natural world. Conservation psychology seeks to leverage the knowledge gained from the study of human behavior, motivation, and social psychology to promote environmental action. Eco-psychology focuses on a return to and a reconnection with our natural world, drawing on our capacities as a spiritual and meaning-making entity, and often drawing on indigenous wisdom traditions, which keep humanity embedded in the natural world. After all, the threats that we face are not only problems to be solved, but are also existential in scope. That is, they have far-reaching ramifications for our freedom, our sense of meaning, and our mortality as individuals and as a collective species and member of all the species of the world. If there's no escape from living within the Anthropocene through what is now being termed the sixth great extinction, then we must choose how to live in this space. At the time of this recording, there are currently 56 wildfires burning in 16 states across North America, having just burned over 600,000 acres. The Southwest is experiencing the worst heat wave on record. The Southeast has experienced devastating floods this past year. And we are just over a year into the most global pandemic in history, which can directly be linked to human overpopulation and encroachment on wild habitats, which bring us in closer contact with pathogens that were once previously geographically isolated from us. Yesterday, a draft version of the IPCC's 2022 summary report was leaked. The bleak predictions that we continue to accelerate towards multiple systemic points of no return, and that while life on Earth can recover, humans cannot. Close quote. We continue to watch politicians, corporations, and many average persons center their own desires for material growth and comfort at the expense of our planet and the planet's most vulnerable occupants. 200 species went extinct just today, and 200 will go extinct tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. If you've been able to remain open to any of these words, to hear them and to not disconnect or discount them, you're likely feeling acutely, which is what is now being referred to as eco-anxiety. Anxiety is a physical, mental, and emotional response to threat. It activates our bodies and our minds to prepare for something dangerous that is happening or may happen. It orients us, causes us to focus, and puts us on guard against that threat. The threat of ecological disaster is very real, and many people suffer annually due to such disasters. In a large-scale analysis of the effects of climate disaster, somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 40% of affected persons present with some form of subsequent psychopathology. This is the term that we use to describe psychological distress, And short-term effects might include things like anxiety, fear, phobic reactions, depression, or somatic complaints. In the long term, this can shift for some into the experience of post-traumatic stress disorder. As a specific example, following Hurricane Sandy in 2012, 16% of persons in highly affected communities showed clear signs of post-traumatic stress reactions. Beyond the imminent threats that we face and respond to with anxiety, there are also long-term certainties and uncertainties about what is going to happen as the earth warms, sea ice melts, reefs die, forests disappear, and so on. Eco-anxiety can manifest as a heightened emotional, mental, or somatic distress in response to dangers in the climate system. It's accompanied by a range of associated emotional responses as well. Things like anger, helplessness, sadness, grief, numbing, and/or restlessness. The American Psychiatric Association now recognizes climate change as a growing threat to mental health. But many mental health professionals feel wholly unequipped to handle the growing number of people anxious and grieving over the state of the planet. As a clinician myself, I can attest that it's one thing to help a client work through their fear of social situations or their generalized anxiety or through a traumatic experience. It's quite another to sit with someone who feels guilty and powerless for the sake of their children and grandchildren having to live in an increasingly inhospitable world. I believe it's going to continue to become increasingly necessary for mental health professionals to develop competence in working with climate anxiety, and that many people are going to benefit from developing the sorts of skills that help them better cope with climate anxiety. However, my hope is not that we can learn to control or eliminate our anxiety about a changing world, but that we can learn to listen to and honor our experience of eco-anxiety. The reason why is best articulated by environmentalist Graham Lawton in an article in the New Scientist, saying this: if anxiety is treated as pathology, then the forces of denial will have won. What we are witnessing is not a tsunami of mental illness, but a long overdue outbreak of sanity. Lawton is clearly making the point that our anxiety is absolutely appropriate for our situation. And if we fail to turn towards and listen intently to the preservationist message that it offers us, then our worst fears will come to pass. Related to the concept of eco-anxiety is another experience which I find fascinating to work with because it honors not only our inner person, but our connection to place, thereby decentering the human and reconnecting us with nature. This concept is called solastalgia. Solastalgia is a form of what environmental scientist Greg Albrecht calls a psychoterratic illness. Psychoterratic illnesses are a variation of somatoterratic illnesses. Soma meaning body, terratic meaning earth-related. These are illnesses that threaten physical well-being and are caused mainly by living in ecosystems that have been contaminated by pollutants and toxins. For example, the increased rate of cancer in rural Kentucky, near where I live, which are directly a result of the destructive and toxic mining practices that the area faces. Psychoterratic illness is defined as an earth-related mental illness, where people's mental well-being, that is their psyche, is threatened by the severing of healthy links between themselves and their home territory. In the same way that nostalgia is a sense of missing a lost time in our lives or a homesickness, solastalgia refers to our loss of place, a loss of our grounding in the world. It's a form of homesickness when we are still at home. Therefore, solastalgia refers to the kind of pain or distress caused by the loss of or inability to derive solace, connected negatively to perceived states of one's home environment. Solastalgia exists when there's the lived experience of a physical desolation of our homes. Solastalgia cuts deeper than anxiety. It undermines aspects of our identity and our sense of self. It will require not only individual work, but also the work of communities and a reimagining of how our identities are tied to location. For example, global sea level rise in the next century is going to affect somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 to 300 million people, mostly vulnerable and unable to simply pack up, leave, and move to a new area. What will happen when the people that inhabit coastlines around the world have that coastline move several miles even inland? Where will they go? Who will they be if they are no longer people of the coast, if the coast is no longer there? Finally, I want to turn an examining eye on the topic of sustainability itself. One of psychology's great values is in the analysis of what and why we do what we do. We often think that we are in full control and awareness of our motivations, and we often assume that we act out of the best of intentions. But sometimes upon closer examination, we recognize that we are actually hiding hard truths from ourselves because their admission might require some profound re-examination of our being. Sometimes we do things not because they are the right thing to do, but because the act of doing something, anything, keeps fear at arm's length. So what happens if we turn that inner looking gaze towards the idea of sustainability? One interesting fact about sustainability is that it's a relatively new environmental term. Historically, we talked mostly about conservation and preservation of natural resources. Sustainability, as you've likely learned in this class, is actually an attempt to avoid the overall depletion of a resource in order to maintain some degree of ecological balance. It's about living in a way that we can get our needs met, but not undermine too much the potential needs of future generations. Sustainability thereby denotes, and this may be a provocative position to take, and I hope we can talk about it further when we have our open discussions. But sustainability denotes continued use and exploitation of the planet, albeit in a slower and perhaps more controlled manner. I think the shift from preservation and conservation towards sustainable development largely came about because not turning the beings with whom we share our planet into commodified resources, that is, objects to be bought and sold for profit, was largely incompatible with our cultural system of industrialized capitalism. In this sense, sustainable development isn't so much good as it is less bad than our current business as usual models. It also continues to center human over planetary needs. In spite of the clear evidence that this Enlightenment-informed thinking that centralizes human desires and needs has led to the wholesale exploitation of 2/3 of the planet's surface, along with the indigenous peoples who once called these lands home. While we know their ecological practices were not perfectly sustainable, they were clearly less destructive than our current models. Here's another example of how we can be misled by the promise of something considered sustainable in our current cultural system. About 760 power plants in the United States alone run on the burning of what is called biomass. Biomass is considered a renewable resource. That is, it's made up of leftover bits from furniture manufacturing, chipped up pieces of trees that can't be sold as lumber, and other brush materials. Because biomass can be regrown, it's considered a renewable resource and therefore often exempted from calculations and sanctions related to carbon emissions. However, biomass is very much less energy efficient than coal and actually produces more carbon emissions into the atmosphere. The argument is that unlike coal, trees and vegetation can be replanted and therefore are sustainable. However, trees do not make a forest. The structure and biodiversity of a so-called sustainable tree farm are starkly different from the forest which once stood in its place. The delicate systems that took centuries, maybe even millennia, to sustain the living beings that lived therein cannot be sustainably replaced. In my own home state, coal companies are given right-of-way to clear-cut and explode whole mountainsides to extract the coal, as long as they promise to half-heartedly grate and reseed these areas. These regreening practices barely protect against erosion and the fouling of local water supplies, let alone return the area to a state even approximating something like a forest. If we're unattentive, sustainability can easily become a buffer to our anxiety, a way of helping us feel good about our own actions or the actions of systems that we participate in. The suggestion is not that you should abandon your own practices in sustainability, but the problem is not your practices. One of the greatest acts of cultural displacement is the lie that living sustainably is the responsibility of private citizens. LED light bulbs and shorter showers are not the solution, because the cause is largely industrial, political, and cultural. A relatively small number of people are responsible for making decisions that have sweeping effects on the climate and the planet. It's important to keep in mind that they make such decisions based on demands generated by a culture which we actively participate in. We cannot lay all the blame on oil and gas companies, textile and electronic industries, because they are responding to our demands for new and affordable commodities. Commodities that we actually seek out of an inner sense of lacking, in the false hopes that they will make us feel beautiful, loved, and whole. We can liken the systemic problem to a family where one member suffers a persistent and severe mental illness. While intervening at the level of that individual via some kind of therapeutic or pharmaceutical intervention, some positive change may occur. But unless the underlying structural dynamics of the family that lend to and perpetuate illness, unless those are addressed, any intervention will fall short in its efficacy. It is therefore not just our environmental, industrial, or political practices that require change. Radical, sustainable action means recognizing, admitting, and then committing to cultivating new, sustainable cultural values. We must examine our needs, their functions, and establish ways of meeting those needs that sustains rather than undermines our world. In some ways, this means that we must wake up to a very frightening reality about ourselves and our world. But only through courageous acts of love and work will we be able to conquer that fear and face our future. Thanks.